you talk about this early 2000s digital media scene where people are meeting in bars in New York, and many of them went on to be, hugely influential players in the digital media space. Obviously, Nick Denton and Jonah Peretti, but a handful of other names I think some people might not be familiar with. Maybe not necessarily in these bar meetings, but in the Huffington Post world or in the BuzzFeed orbit. You mentioned Andrew Breitbart, who came out of Huffington Post, Chris Poole, who started 4chan, worked out of the BuzzFeed office for a while. I learned that from the book. But there are also a couple of names that people I know are familiar with. This is Benny Johnson, Baked Alaska, that came out of the BuzzFeed orbit. On the latter two especially, I'm curious how you feel about their post-BuzzFeed trajectory. And you spent some time talking about a conversation you had with Benny in the book. And you admit that his story about contemplating suicide, holding a gun to his head after he was fired for plagiarism, but his faith saving him, might be slightly exaggerated. I'm just curious how you see both of their post-BuzzFeed trajectories.
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, one of the real surprises for me of reporting the whole book out was seeing that this moment when everybody thought the internet was liberal and was a place where it was Barack Obama's home court in some sense in the early aughts, in these places like Huffington Post, like Facebook, it becomes clear 10 years later that Donald Trump is the inheritor of this whole world. And then when you look back, it's like, oh, these figures who created the new right were all there from the start too. The guy who created 4chan worked out of BuzzFeed's office. Andrew Breitbart co-founded Huffington Post. Gavin McInnes, who founded the Proud Boys, also co-founded Vice. I mean, it's sort of wild to think about, actually. And it was all mixed up together. And I think, in my own minor part in this, I hired a guy named Benny Johnson from The Blaze to do, and I think there's a long tradition in mainstream American media that I think is super healthy of deliberately going out and trying to find conservatives for your newsroom, because at the moment it's too bad. The big newsrooms are on the coast and mostly populated by people who went to college, and it's a liberal demographic. Not everybody's liberal or cares that much about politics, but it's healthy to have people who come from a different place of all sorts, but ideological diversity is one of them. But who basically share your commitment to figuring out what's going on and writing that down. I mean, that's the job. But don't have the same blind spots as you. And Benny Johnson was somebody I thought was that long tradition of hiring conservatives, but really was something else. He was sort of interested in chasing the traffic wherever it led. And if it led to stuff that wasn't tethered to reality, that's fine. And was sort of an avatar of this new kind of Trumpy politics. He's now the creative director of Turning Point USA. The more purist figure of this is a guy named Baked Alaska, who I didn't know at BuzzFeed, but worked at BuzzFeed when I was there. And he was a white rapper from Alaska, that's his name, who'd become a little bit famous on Vine remember Vine? He was doing stuff like pouring cartons of milk on his head. That was what got you famous on Vine. But it was just somebody who wanted attention and feedback and approval, and eventually found it on Twitter by saying extreme right-wing things. And so he'd been left-wing, and then he followed the energy all the way to, I sort of lost track of him and then saw him live streaming his storming of the Capitol on January 6th.
Do you feel, I guess this is a two-part question. Do you feel that BuzzFeed equipped them to be the warriors they are in kind of this culture war? And also you were a bit, in some parts you were introspective and critical of things that you had done. You admit that you had overlooked some of Benny Johnson's other reporting about the new Black Panthers and his posts about them and influencing elections. And I'm curious also within that, how you decided to interject yourself into this book where applicable, because you weren't in it much. And I was curious to hear more about your role in some of these big things.
Yeah, I mean, I was, I think, genuinely kind of a secondary character in this era. I was sort of watching and in my little political reporting space in New York City Hall copying a lot of the things that Gawker was doing early on, but I wasn't part of that scene. And then got to BuzzFeed in 2012, and at moments played a real role in things like the dossier, but didn't, and so there are parts of the book where I'm a character and parts where I'm really not. And to me, the most fun parts of the book are where I went and reported out stuff that I was not there for and was super curious about, honestly.
But I guess on the helping shape them, equip them question, how do you see BuzzFeed's role in that? And do you think, is there any shared responsibility, or is this just, a
yes. I
risk
mean, I
or a
do think that we
consequence?
sort of helped give these guys, create, to some degree, this whole, we specifically in those cases, but also broadly, this new digital media world did, I think, help the sort of progressive digital media world, or the mainstream one, certainly helped create these and sharpen these tools that would then be used by the right, for sure.